Good morning. My name is Joan Osgood, and I'm a volunteer of the Friends of Sandwich Town Archives. On behalf of this volunteer group, I want to welcome you to our oral history project, Tell Me a Story, where we chat with longtime residents for their view on the past, having lived in Sandwich. So we're going to have a little fun today. We're going to hear from one of our longtime residents and hear some stories of the past, Sandwich's past, through the eyes and ears and memories of Carol Foster Tellegen. Welcome, Carol.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us.
No problem.
Okay. Well, we have some questions that I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot about different things, but just to sort of start the conversation, first I'd like to ask you about your ancestors. Who came to Sandwich, and then we'll talk a little about your parents and your family.
Okay,
but did your parents, grandparents, and do you have any knowledge about the ancestors? Because the Fosters were here for quite a while.
The Fosters have been here for quite a while. They married into the Nye, Dillingham, and Lloyd family.
Oh, wow, okay.
And James D. Lloyd was my great-great-grandfather, and he was a color expert at the Sandwich Glass Factory.
At the Sandwich Glass Factory.
Right.
Okay, so there is a long history there.
There
yes.
is a history there. And
What exactly did a colorist do?
he developed all the different chemical combinations for the different colors.
Oh.
And he was responsible for the ruby
Oh my gosh.
color, which, as I understand it, involved adding quite a bit of gold. And they could not afford all the gold for it, but he developed another process where they did come up with a ruby color. And that's from what I understand from family lore.
Yes, well, because that color was people were very fond of that.
Yes, and it was fairly rare.
Very rare, yeah.
And they do have a special room at the Glass Museum with a collection of things that he used in developing the colors, and also his notebook that he used. And there is a narrative that explains exactly how things went. And my brother Bill is the narrator for this particular segment. So when you go in and hit the little button there, he starts talking and he'll explain the whole thing.
Well, I'll be darned. Isn't that wonderful? But that's a great story.
Yeah.
Now that was, and his last name was Lloyd.
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 Yes. James
Lloyd.
D. Lloyd. James Danforth Lloyd.
Yep. Now, what about, you mentioned a couple other names that I recognized.
Yeah. The Nyes and the Dillinghams somehow are all woven into the fabric of the Foster genealogy.
Yes.
And my mom was told when she first came as a bride, now maybe be careful what you say about people because we're all related.
I know. Our archivist, who had been with Sandwich for years and years, retired just recently, Barbara Gill, used to say that too.
Yeah.
You know, so much intertwining and so much intermarriage, yes.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah. Because like she said, in those days, I mean, there weren't a lot of people, so who did you marry?
Exactly. You had to go out of town, I guess.
Yes, yeah. So that's, yes, because when I knew that we were going to be chatting with you, I told my brother Bill, and he went on to the 1855 census, and there were a full 12 to 15 Fosters listed in 1855.
Right.
Yeah. So you've been here a long time.
Yeah. One of the Fosters was John Foster, who built the masthead.
Oh my gosh.
And he was a dance master, and he had a studio in Paris. And I guess he taught all the the elite.
The elite in
The
Paris.
elite, and I believe, according to family history, that one of his students was one of the princes of England.
Wow.
So,
wow.
it's,
Now tell us a little about Masthead for the people that perhaps might be watching this and not
the
on Spring Hill.
Masthead is a house that was built at the top of Spring Hill, and one of the rooms is an actual aft portion of a ship.
An actual ship.
An actual
that
ship.
They integrated into the architecture.
Right. And exactly. And, and I remember when I was very young going up to the building with my dad.
Oh.
And just going into this particular room, and at that time there was a massive pool table. I was like, wow, how did they get that in here? But it was, I don't remember too much about it. It was quite a feat at that time to have built a home of that substance.
Yes.
And
so unique.
It is unique, and
yes.
the fireplace itself is all white stones brought up from the beach.
Oh my gosh.
So,
yes.
you know, white and gray stones that they built. And it's one of the things that I vividly remember, that and the view.
Yeah, and the view from this.
From
you can
there.
see.
Yeah, because at that time when it was built, there were no trees up on the top of Spring Hill.
Yes.
And somewhere I have, or my cousin Sue would have, a picture of my mom, of my dad, and my aunt, and all the people from Spring Hill. Someone had landed a biplane up on top of the meadow, and they were all standing there with the, you know, having a picture with, with the plane.
With this unusual sight, yes.
Exactly, yeah.
Isn't that something? A biplane.
A biplane.
Yes, so that would speak to the fact that there wouldn't have been as many trees as there are now, so that the plane could have landed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a unique thing, and it still is. Does your family still own it?
No.
No.
I believe at one point it belonged to the gentleman that had before, I can't think of his name now.
No, I think at one point, did the Schumacher?
Schumacher.
Yes.
Schumacher, and then he sold it to the gentleman that has it now, Mr.
Yes.
Allen.
Yes.
And I don't know, at one time it was for sale, so I don't know if someone has purchased it.
Purchased it again.
Again, but
yes.
It is a unique piece of
property.
It is, yeah.
Well, you must, I mean, when you think about it, you must have a great sense of pride to know how far back your roots go in Sandwich.
Yeah.
You know,
it's amazing when I look at the family tree, and you know, you can go back generation after generation and see where they came from, or have a source to be able to go back and research it some more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your family, with those names, especially the Dillingham and the Nine, now that goes back to the Mayflower, does it not?
I believe it does.
Yes.
My mom had told me at one point that Peregrine White, who was born on the Mayflower, I believe it was either the second or third trip. It wasn't the original trip. But Peregrine White was one of the first children actually born on the Mayflower on one of the voyages.
I remember reading that.
And so that, you know, has an impact on, you know, on our genealogy.
Yes.
And on my mother's side, her cousin could trace her roots back to the original colonist.
Now, what was your mother's maiden name?
My mother's maiden name was Brenton.
Oh, okay.
And her family was from Newfoundland, and they came down. My grandfather was a fisherman out of New Bedford.
Oh my gosh, yep.
And my mom was actually adopted by her aunt and uncle because her mother died when she was quite young. So she grew up in Brockton, and
That was not unusual in those days with her father being out
Right.
to sea so much that
Exactly.
family members would take
step
over
in and take
over bringing the child up. Yes, yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
She was very fortunate to be
yeah,
able to have
she
that.
was.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure she had a lot of good memories.
Yeah.
Well, that is just very, very interesting. Maybe we can switch a little more to current times and talk about your mom and dad
Yeah.
and your family. First, let me ask, how did they meet? And when did they get married?
Oh, okay. Like I said, my mom grew up in Brockton, and she would go over to Gramp Reynolds' farm, and she would help with milking the goats and everything over there.
Over there, sure.
And he raised chickens.
Now, excuse me, about what time was that? I mean, in
That was
terms
back,
of years, would that have been?
See, she was born in 22, so I would say probably late 30s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
Teenager.
She was a teenager, and my dad would come up to Gramp Reynolds' farm, which is where the Westgate Mall is now, by the way.
Oh my gosh.
And he would come up and get his chicks, and if he needed a new rooster or whatever, he'd go up to Gramp Reynolds' farm. Well, that's where they met. But Mom was only like 13 or 14, and Dad was 7 years her senior.
Ah.
So he used to tease her and say, after they got married in 1942, I believe, and he would tease her and say, May, I had to wait for you to grow up before we could get married.
Oh, isn't that, yeah.
Because of the 7-year difference.
Yes.
But yeah, they...
Now, he was from Sandwich at that point.
Right. He was born and raised in Sandwich. And
now, what was he doing? What was the need for him to go up to for the chickens?
We had a self-sustaining farm.
Oh, okay.
I grew up on the farm where we had chickens and goats, and we always had a pig, and they would hire out, they would buy a young steer, and it would be over at Magnuson's farm.
Oh, sure.
This is where it was raised. So we always had, fresh meats and everything. I was raised on goat's milk, and at one point my husband told me the reason I was so stubborn was because I was raised on goat's milk. But Dad's father was a cranberry grower.
Oh, okay.
So we had 26 acres of cranberry bogs, and we would, so he would, had the bogs, and he had
He'd have that responsibility and the farm.
He delivered ice.
Boy.
So when he was younger, he would go down to Hoxie Pond, and they would harvest the ice, and they called it brown ice because of the algae and stuff, but they used it just in the ice boxes.
Oh, sure.
Yes,
they weren't consuming it. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So he was the Iceman. And
amongst other things.
And Mom would come down before they got married, she'd come down on the train, and he'd pick her up in Buzzards Bay, and she'd go out and deliver ice with him. And there's a cute story of this one lady on Spring Hill Beach who left early, but she left a little note for him. Here's $1 for all the ice. Please use the remainder to buy a new pipe. That one stinks.
Oh my gosh.
And I believe...
And $1, and there still would be remainder.
And there would be, I think it would be like 50 cents or something for the ice or something like that. So that was, and Mom kept the note, and that actually is in one of the books that I brought today.
That you're giving to the archives.
Exactly.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
So, and so from there, after they got married, there was 4 of us came along in rapid concession,
Yep.
But we all lived and had our sustenance from the farm. We had always had big gardens and things like that. So we all had our chores that we would do.
Yeah.
And
What would particularly be your chore?
I had to collect the eggs.
Oh, you had to collect the eggs.
And it was not my favorite thing to do. We had this old broody hen who did not like to have her eggs taken. So you had to go like this and quickly before she got you on the back of the hand.
Yeah. And not break the egg.
And not break the egg,
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
But that was one of my chores to do, was to collect the eggs and to help Mom and Dad with the feeding of the animals and things like that.
Now, of course, having grown up in Sandwich also, I know that your father at some point, back in perhaps 1955, became the chief of police. Is that not so?
Yes.
Yes.
He started on the police force, I believe it was in 1949 or 50, in that range. Gilbert Smith was the chief, and he was the first chief, actually.
Yeah.
And they ran the department from his home. And he decided...
Mr. Smith's home.
Right.
Yeah, that would have been, I think, on Main Street.
Main Street.
Yes, yeah.
And so he finally got the selectmen to say, yes, you know, you can hire somebody. So he and Dad had been good friends for a long time. And so he said, Bill, you know, I need somebody to be my night patrolman. So Dad decided, you know, that would be good because the cranberry crop that year wasn't yielding and the prices were down and everything, and he had a wife and 4 kids to support.
At that point, yes.
Yeah. So this was before they even had a car. The chief used his own car, and at night Dad would go out and he would do the night patrol, and he'd have a certain place, you know, he would walk around.
So we'd have a walking beat, if you will, and also driving the car. Yes.
Right. And then they finally got their own cruiser. So the chief would be on duty, I believe, from like 7 in the morning to 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And then we would go up and Dad would pick up the car and he'd go on duty until like 4 in the morning, because I figured from 4 to 7 there was only 5,000 or 6,000 people in town, and how much trouble can you get into?
Yes, right.
You know,
yeah.
So
but that and so then, but he would go back, and he had all these other duties.
Right.
You know, after having worked all day,
right.
all night.
All night, he'd come home, and at that point, you know, Mom would pick up the slack. You know, she'd go out and make sure that the animals were fed and everything. And then in the afternoon, if he was delayed doing something else, it would be her job to go out and milk the goats.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And we had this one particular goat named Claudia, who was very stubborn and didn't like to be milked by Mom. Dad was fine, but Mom, she didn't like.
Isn't that something?
So she kept, every once in a while, she kicked the bucket.
Oh, no.
So one day she kicked it one time too many, and Mom really, who very rarely got angry, picked up that bucket of milk and threw it right in her face and threw it on the floor and stomped home.
Oh,
so
that was the end of that.
So Dad came home and he said to her, well, anything exciting happened? And so she told him, and she was all puffed up and, you know, and you could hear him laughing all the way out to the barn. Because she was so angry, he just went out and finished the chores.
Well, I remember your mother as very petite.
Yes.
You know, and very small. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You know,
Dad was 6'4" and she was 5'2".
And your dad was a big guy.
Yeah. I think the most she ever weighed was maybe 100 pounds.
Soaking
wet.
As they say, yes. Yeah. Do you have any stories that you could share that your dad perhaps shared with you, being the police chief for those number of years?
Dad was very close-mouthed when it came to actually what was going on.
Yeah.
He was raised Quaker.
Oh, okay.
And he didn't, he believed that if you didn't have anything good to say, as he would say, keep your trap shut.
Yeah.
So he didn't really share anything that was going on with us as children.
Yes.
Because he figured it was none of our business.
Yes. Yes.
But later on in life, he did recordings of stories. You know, he recorded stories of his times as a policeman, starting as a patrolman and working forward. And he also had them, he typed them up. So we have a written and an oral storyline to go with, which I am going to
yes, which
make
you
sure
kindly have donated to the archives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of fun stories. One in particular was of a gentleman that was termed the town drunk. Every town had one at that point.
We had characters in town, didn't we?
We did have a lot of characters.
Yes, we did.
Well, this fellow was in the habit of walking up to the Catholic cemetery to take a snooze. Well, not knowing that someone in town had passed on and there was going to be a funeral, he went up to the cemetery and unfortunately fell into the open grave. And he was crying out, you know, I'm not dead. I'm not dead. Help me. So someone in the neighborhood just happened to hear him at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they called the chief's house, and actually my mom answered the phone, and then she called him on the radio and said, you know, go up to the Catholic cemetery and rescue so-and-so. So he went up with a ladder and helped this gentleman out of the pit and kindly drove him up to the Bourne lockup for safekeeping for the night.
Yes, because Sandwich perhaps didn't have one at that point.
We didn't have one at the time.
Yes,
so,
we were lucky to have a car.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah.
And if any female in town got into a little bit of a snag, Mom was the first matron. So Dad would call her and say, come on, May, we've got to go to Buzzards Bay. And she would go up and make sure that the woman was properly taken care of.
They were a real team, weren't they? I can hear that.
Yeah,
you know,
they
with
were
your
a
family
team.
life, with his professional life.
Right.
Yes.
Everything blended together.
Yes.
And, he and another gentleman in town, who I cannot remember the name of, started the Cub Scouts, Pack 57.
Oh, yes.
Or is it 47?
47.
47.
Yes.
And Mom was one of the first leaders, Cub leaders. And I was always upset because the boys got to do all these projects and I had to sit in the other room. But she also, when she first came to town, was a Girl Scout leader. Mm-hmm. And some of the ladies in town remember her as their Girl Scout leader. And her nickname was Jackie at that time, which I have no idea how that came about. But Barbara Morrow was one of them.
Yes, yeah. And so they talked to you about their times with your mom. Yeah. Isn't that nice?
Yeah. And as things progressed with the scouting program, it was built up quite heavily. Of course, my brothers were involved in everything.
Yes.
And
in scouting, and Eagle Scouts, yes.
And my dad was one of the first people in this area to get the Scouting Oscar.
Really? What does that mean? What is that?
It's an award, a recognition given to leaders who have helped develop programs and things like that.
Oh, wow.
And
yes.
My grandpa Newsom, my mom's uncle who took her in, was a Beaver Scout. So there's all sorts of connections in there.
Yes.
And so they were a team.
Yes,
yeah,
I can hear that.
They worked together,
yes.
and on the bogs. And I can remember as a child that they would have workers come in to pick the bogs, and that was before the automation.
Oh yes, it was
so they would all have. That was all hand picking with the scoops, and we would go down and we would watch them, and they'd start on one end next to each other, and they would just rock and scoop and dump and down, and then they'd go, and it was absolutely amazing to watch these people in synchronization.
Yes.
And I remember this one colored lady who smoked a corncob pipe.
As she was picking?
As she was picking it,
Yes.
she'd puff. And I would sit there and I would at that point, we had never seen a person of color.
Yes, yes.
Never alone a woman with a pipe.
With a pipe.
So we would sit there and we would just be,
You'd be
for
intrigued,
hours
yes.
just fascinated by this lady named Pearl.
Oh my gosh. And did they, I've seen pictures.
Yeah.
They kneeled, did they not, or did they just bend over?
No, they kneeled.
I thought, so, yes.
Yeah, they were on their hands and knees with the
With the scoop.
scoop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, my mom had one made for her. My brother Austin has it now.
Oh, he does.
Yeah.
Wow. Yes.
So
That's a wonderful keepsake. Yes.
it is, yeah.
Yes. Those scoops now, if you can find an old one, are very valuable.
they are.
Yeah.
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 And that was, and everything would be put in the boxes, and then the boxes would be put on what's called a bog barrow, which was a flat wheelbarrow, and taken up and put through a shaker and everything, and then loaded on the truck, and it would be taken down to West Barnstable,
Oh, yes.
where the old Cranberry Exchange was, which is, I believe, there's a bank and a post office there now.
Of course.
On 6A. So it was a lot of interesting times, and we would spend our summers either at the beach or on the bogs.
On the bog. You were expected,
Yeah,
to
and we
work.
we
sure.
would be given the chore of hand picking the berries along the bog ditches.
Oh, okay.
And we would get paid, maybe 10 cents for a big box. We thought,
Yes.
wow, we got a
Wow,
dime. That's pretty good.
Yeah. How many acres did your father have? Or
I
did your
believe it
family
was
have?
26 to 30
Wow.
in that
Yes.
area.
Yes, and it was in the Spring Hill area.
It was in Spring Hill.
Do they
and
still exist, Carol?
They're now all overgrown. Part of it now is Joe's Woods. It's all conservation.
Okay.
My brother's, part of my brother's property is one of the old bogs. And I remember in the winter we could put our skates on at home and literally skate around,
the bogs.
around the bogs.
Yeah.
And, it was safe to do that because if you fell through, you only went in 6 inches. Unless you hit one of the big ditches and then you went to your waist. But
Yes,
then
yes.
you got up and went home and changed your clothes.
I can remember skating on the bogs there. Jane Shelley.
Yes.
And her father
Right.
owned a bog, right? And I can
Right.
remember. And skating, and with your cousin,
Yeah.
who I graduated in high school with,
Yeah.
Susan Pierce.
Right.
Yes, yeah. And that was good because unless you hit like one of the leaves or something like
Right.
that from the cranberries,
Yeah.
you really, if you fell.
It wasn't a big
Right.
deal. Yeah.
Your mother, your father, of course, is very well known in town from those of us that have been here for a while. But in addition to that, your mom had quite a career, if you will, here. Now, she was the first, you touched on it a little, but she was the first dispatcher, the
She
first
was.
woman dispatcher
She was the
on Cape
first
Cod.
woman dispatcher on Cape Cod. When they built the new fire and police station, which is now just the fire station, my dad had an office, and Fred Alvisi, the fire chief, had an office, and out in the lobby was a little corner for dispatch. And Mom and Barbara Slade,
Oh, yes.
they would take turns, and then I don't remember who else was in there, but she would dispatch, and all the fellows down at the sheriff's department, where everything was dispatched through, would hear her voice come through in this big booming voice. Well, the first time they met her, that's not the same woman.
That can't be the voice coming out of
This
that little woman.
Little 5'2" person with a voice like a foghorn.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Now, did she dispatch earlier, before that building was built? As you say, that's the
only-
current fire.
yeah, the
Did
only-
she do it from her home?
Yeah, there was a line in the house for the police, and before that, we had a 4-party line. So they had to put in a special line just for the police department because the Finnish ladies in the area would always be on the phone, and we'd pick up the phone and they go from English to Finnish, so we wouldn't know what they were talking about.
Yes.
But
And that wasn't too good for an emergency
no,
to get
it
through.
wasn't.
No,
but
no.
she would dispatch. She would, calling. This was, one two-way radio. This
Yes.
was no cell phones or
Can you
anything.
imagine?
Yeah.
I mean, how things have changed,
Yeah.
yes. Dispatching from your home.
Yeah.
Now, she also spent quite a bit of her time at Greenbrier, did she not?
She did.
Yes.
There's a kind of a family history there too. Ida Putnam, I believe, was an aunt by marriage.
By marriage?
And so that was actually my second job that I had, was at Greenbrier.
It was.
And I would go in and label, and that was with the white glue where you had
Yeah, yes.
So I'd go in the afternoon. I'd work at Crow Farm in the morning.
Yeah, now this would be in the summertime.
In the summertime.
Yes.
And go home and shower and then go over and work over there in the afternoon. And I did this for a long time. And then Mom went to work for Aunt Martha Blake.
Yeah.
And she would work for her for quite a while, for quite a good many years. And then when Thornton Burgess took over, Mom became the kitchen manager.
Oh, she did.
And she was the manager there for, 10 years or more. And she retired, and then she went back as a volunteer. And that particular year, she got an award for more volunteer hours than paid hours the year before. So she did this for a couple of years, and then she retired again.
Yeah.
And then she went back again, and then she finally retired
She
for good.
I've had enough of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So from the family aspect, it's been in the family. It's in the blood.
Yes.
And I still do preserves at home.
You do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can talk a little bit more about that. But you had mentioned first that you first worked before going to Greenbrier at Crow Farm.
At
Can
Crow
you tell
Farm?
us a little bit about that experience?
I think everybody in town at one time has worked at Crow Farm from that genre. And Mr. Kroll was quite a character. And he'd stand there in the morning with his pencil, and he'd get out his paper, a little notebook, and he'd say, "Today, Jim, you're going to do this. Carol, I want you to go and weed the onions." And I'd, okay. So I'd go out, and we had these special tools, and you're on your hands and knees, you've got this whole long row of onions, and so I'm going down the row, and I see a little carrot sprout. So it's a vegetable, so I kept right on going. Well, when I finished, he came to inspect the work, and he said, "You did very well, except for the one thing." He said, "You see that?" And I said, "Yeah, it's a carrot." He said, "No, it's a weed because it's in the onion patch." So after that, it was like if I was weeding, if there was something that wasn't there,
Yes, even if it was a vegetable.
Vegetable, it
Yes,
doesn't
it
belong
wasn't
there.
in the right aisle. It wasn't in the right row.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or we'd be picking strawberries or raspberries, and then the beans would come into season, so he'd send you to do, pick beans, things like that. Well, the one thing that the boys would never pick was lima beans. They're so flat, it would take you 10 years to fill a bushel,
Yes, I
So that was one of the jobs that I really didn't like, because you got paid by what you picked.
By the bushel, yes.
Right.
Yes. And they
So-
are so flat.
They
would
are
take
flat,
yes.
So I think 1 week I made like 40 cents or something like that, because that took me all week to pick all the
Oh
lima
my gosh.
beans.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. And also, too, they had my sister Barbara and I worked, as you say, most everyone in town of that genre worked at Crow Farm. The bugs, the slugs,
Oh yeah.
trying to,
Yeah.
pick the beans, and there were a lot of slugs, because I guess they didn't use
No pesticides. It was
pesticides.
fully organic.
Yes, yes.
And I remember at one point he put geese up in the strawberry patch
Oh,
to get the bugs.
what a unique idea, yes.
But it was good for the geese, not good for the bugs. It wasn't really good for people picking either, because you had to be very careful where you step. But that was one of the ways that they handled
Yes.
that particular thing. But it was all organic, and I believe today that's pretty much is still in organic farming.
Yes, I believe it is. And isn't it wonderful? It's still
is.
in the family after all these generations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's,
Yeah.
it really is was quite a huge undertaking for the family, I believe, at that time. But
Yes.
it was fun. We had a lot of fun. And,
Along the way, yes.
Along the way, a lot of laughs.
Yeah. And you might have had a buck or two at the end of the week.
Right.
To
At
do something with.
60 cents an hour.
Yes.
If you were, or if you were
Or by the
weeding,
bush,
or
yeah.
by the quart, pint, or whatever. Yeah. And back then it was quite a good deal of money.
Yes.
You
Yes,
know.
it was. Sure. Yeah. Now, being a lifelong resident of Sandwich, of course, you went to school here.
Yes.
And you, of course, went to the Henry T. Wing School.
I did.
Yes, back in those days, all grades 1 through 12 were
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it didn't have the additions.
No,
that
no
it has
additions
now.
at all. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about your memories of that.
I remember being scared to death to go to first grade.
Oh,
And Mrs. Strain was our first grade
oh
teacher.
yes.
And she was a little stern.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that about her.
Yes.
I remember Miss Consolini, who was a third grade teacher, she was stern, but they were all good teachers,
Yes.
good people, and they cared for their students. I think my favorite teacher was Mrs. Snow.
Oh yes.
She was
Yes.
she was very sweet, and but she kept your nose to the grindstone. You learned,
Yes.
but you wanted to learn.
Yeah.
It wasn't.
Now, what grade was she, Carol?
She was fifth grade.
Fifth grade, yeah. Yeah.
And I remember she received the an award for a teacher's award from Valley Forge Teachers Award one year. That was quite a big award at that time. I don't even know if they give it out anymore.
Yeah.
But I remember going down to the auditorium, which was actually auditorium and gymnasium.
Gymnasium.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the big thing was going from that one area up to 7th and 8th grade. That was the huge, everybody looked forward. I'm going to be a 7th grader,
Right.
and I'm going upstairs,
Upstairs, yeah. Yeah.
And I have vivid memories of Eddie Rose.
Oh, sure.
And I believe it was Krakenbaum and
Bobby Craig.
Bobby Krakenbaum
Yes.
and Jimmy Crocker
Oh, sure. Yeah.
opened the window. This is on the 3rd floor.
Oh, boy.
The rhododendrons were in bloom,
Yes, those lovely.
and they hung Ed out the window by his ankles so he could pick the flowers. And Miss French, who was language teacher, came in and almost had a heart attack. So
my God.
they hauled him back up,
in.
and he said, "Flowers?"
Yeah, there were a lot of shenanigans, but it seemed like it was good fun.
It was healthy fun. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was things that today would be considered a no-no, but
Yes.
these guys, they had so much energy.
Yes.
That they got it out one way or the
Oh,
other.
the other. Yeah.
Whether it was taking somebody's bloomers from the girls' locker room and flying them up the flagpole or things like that, or going on Halloween and collecting Mr. Matson's bull, and they bring it over and they staked it out on the playing fields behind the school. And
Oh my gosh! Now, Mr. Matson, of course, he lived on Charles Street.
Right.
So they took his bull.
Right, up through Crowell's
Oh,
farm.
farm. Gotcha.
Through Crow Farm, through the apple groves and things, and brought him down.
Oh my God!
And then the next morning, of course, our poor Mr. Carson, who was
He was
the
Jim Carson. Was it?
I'm not sure what his first name was.
Yes, but
we always called him Mr.
Mr. Carson because
right.
he was, yes.
Yeah, and he was in charge of all cleaning and
At the school, yes.
At the school, and he was fit to be tied, and he called my dad. Dad came up and he lined everybody up, and he said, "Okay, you clowns, whoever brought him here, you take him back, and you do it now, you know." So.
Yeah.
And when you get back, you can bring a shovel because you're going to clean up after the cow, after the bull. So that was one of the things that I remember.
Yes, yeah.
From there, and it was a wonderful time because nobody wanted to skip school unless it was hunting season and the guys went out hunting or whatever.
Yes,
yes. And at one time there was a huge fire on the base. I don't know if you remember that.
Yes.
And they took all the able-bodied men from town, and then they came and they got the juniors and seniors males, and which weren't that many, but they took them and they all went up to fight.
To help fight the fire.
Yeah.
You mentioned about there weren't that many. How many were in your graduating class?
17.
17.
11 girls and 6 boys.
Gosh, yeah. And you probably pretty much went right straight through 1 through 12.
1 through 12 with the same, pretty much the same group.
Pretty much unless they moved away.
We would have some people come in from the base.
Sure.
You know, to school, but pretty much I would say maybe 99% of the people we went to school with.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah. A big thing at the school, because it was a smaller town then, for sure. And so what were some of the school, I think, took over being responsible or for a lot of social activities.
Yeah.
Do you recall some of those?
Yes. They always had a talent show. And Mrs. McCann was our teacher, and she was also, I took piano lessons from her.
Did you? Yes.
So we always, I always had to play a piece or something like that. The senior class always put on a play, and they would have minstrel shows, which which you can't do today.
Right.
And when we were cleaning out my Aunt Ida's house, which was on Old Main Street, she was a Nye who married into the Lloyd family, and my Uncle Charles Lloyd was an end man. And I have his tambourine.
Oh, do you really?
I do. And inside the tambourine is written some of the lines, and you can still read them. I don't know what the responses are, but I have the lines, you know.
So we wouldn't forget what his lines were.
Exactly.
Isn't that something?
So,
yes.
And I use that in our church now.
Do you?
I do. So
putting it to good use for a different reason altogether.
Exactly.
Yes.
So it was really.
And were there dances or?
We always had. There was always the junior prom, and there were dances, and they always had a harvest festival.
Oh yes.
The school put on a harvest festival, but it was like the town center. Anyone could go in and they'd do all sorts of things to while away the winters, because the winters were long.
Yes, yeah, and the school really did take up a big piece of that in keeping, the children active and involved in things. Yes, that and sports and the different dances, and that was very important. Let me see here now.
It was the social center, really,
of
the town at that time. Yeah.
You mentioned in talking a few minutes ago about the phone system. Of course, now we remember back when you didn't have to dial. You picked up the phone and said, can you please give me,
I want so and so. You'd give a name, and they would just plug you in, and off you'd go. Yeah.
Yes. Do you remember when we finally got dial phones in Sandwich?
Vaguely.
Yes.
I remember, I believe it was a Bakelite phone, which now you can't even find,
sure, yes.
And we'd have, pick it up, wait for the dial tone, and then you'd dial the number. And it was quite an invention.
Yes.
That, and I remember my aunt was one of the first ones that I knew that had a TV.
And that was a big deal.
It was a big deal. The screen was 9 inches square, and the case was like 5 by 5. You know, it was this little thing and this huge thing.
Yeah.
And I remember we would go up once a week to sit and watch. You know, like Howdy Doody or something like that. You know, and that was a big.
And of course, in those days, it was a big deal. In those days, I think it's hard for younger children now to understand that there wasn't programming all the time.
No.
You know, the screen would be blank,
yeah.
for most of the hours of the day.
Yeah.
You know, until a program did come on, you knew when it would come on, like Howdy Doody or one of the Hop Along Cassidy or something. And that you knew, okay, I'm going to sit here now. Otherwise, it was a blank screen.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I remember one of the very first commercials was the Timex, where he dropped the watch in the water, and I was, the first time I saw that, I went, oh, my goodness, you know.
That's a good watch.
And then he pulled it out and it says, Timex takes a lick and it keeps on ticking. And I'll never forget that, because it was, you know, one of those things like, why did he do that? You know, it's a watch, you know, and that was before everybody had a watch.
Well, yes.
You know,
we were not wealthy people in Sandwich. No.
I think when my dad retired or left the police force, I believe it was 1963, he was only making $7,000 a year. And he left because the selectmen had okayed his 2 patrolmen, had given them pay increases to like $8,000 or $9,000, but they refused to increase his.
The chief.
Yeah. So he left and went to work as a deputy sheriff for Barnstable County.
For the county.
Right, and he was there until just before he passed on.
So when he left in the mid to 60s,
in the 60s,
there were only 2 patrolmen to help him.
He had 3. There was John Weaver.
Oh yes.
And Buddy Alvander, and Clyde had just joined.
Oh, Clyde Gill.
And Clyde.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, as a young man at that point, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember, I think I'm going to ask one other thing. This has been so much fun. I hope it has been for you. It has been for me, reminiscing. Do you remember one sort of big event in town that, even at that time, it was thought of as a big deal, that you might recollect?
Well, I think it's hard to remember back, but I know they had, I think every year the big deal was the Memorial Day Parade.
Oh, yes.
And that was huge for everyone in town. I mean, I remember marching in it as a bluebird, and then, you know, and then as the years progressed, marching in it with my boys, because I carried on and was a den mother, and being in awe of the bands and all of that. When you're young, you know, it's like, this is, you know, it was a big event.
It was a big event for Sandwich,
Yeah.
yes.
And
my recollection is we had amongst other bands, but the one I particularly loved was the band from Plymouth.
right.
They were wonderful, yes.
Yeah, and I think one year they had one of the either Army or Air Force marching band, and that was it was quite an event every year. And another thing I remember were the contra dances that on Jarvis Street, where they would close off Jarvis Street, and we would have square dancing and just a fun thing with Mr. Bunker.
Mr. and Mrs. Bunker.
He would call it and everything, and it was something that you look forward to every year, of having this event, and you'd plan your whole life around. When this comes, we're going to do this, and those are a couple of things that I really.
And of course, in
remember.
those days, too, you're talking about events and everything that we would go to, you would look around and you really would know everyone.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you'd say, oh, he looks really good this year, you know?
Yeah.
And you'd see somebody in their Army or their Navy or Marine
Uniform.
and think, wow, they can still fit in that, you know? And they would be so, you know, and there was a town pride.
There was a sense of pride.
There was a tremendous sense of pride in the town,
Yeah, I agree.
in the townspeople of where they were living and that they were all part of this community.
Of course, back then, too, if you think of it, the Second World War hadn't been over that long.
Right.
You know, so it was still so fresh, certainly in the minds of the people that were marching,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
even their family, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
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 And so it was quite an event, you know, and
Yeah.
being able to grow up in that time frame, you know, before all the drugs and everything
Yeah, and
else
all the
came
changes.
in, you know, and being able to bring up my kids in that, you know, in that
Small
in that
town.
small town feel,
Yes.
you know, and it's something that they remember too.
Yes. Yes.
You know, they
Yeah.
even though they went double sessions for a little bit at the wing school, but,
Yeah, till they got the
yeah.
other school built. Yes.
yeah. So, but it's been quite a journey, I think, and being able to go back through my dad's papers and his stories and his recollections and remembering the things that my mom had told me about. You know, it's just
Yes. And you're so lucky that he saved a lot of those things.
he did.
Yes, and I want to thank you on behalf of the Sandwich Friends of the Archives, because being able to have, I guess, some of the originals and certainly copies of these things is a wonderful thing to have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just having. I grew up in Sandwich, but Sandwich grew up in me. You know.
What a nice way of putting it.
You know, it's
Yes.
just one of those. I lived off Cape for a little bit, but it wasn't home.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it wasn't home. You didn't hear the sound of the ocean, and
Yes.
and you didn't see people that you really knew. So it
Yeah,
just,
it's nice to be able to walk down the street or drive down and be able to wave to someone
Yeah.
because you know them.
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Carol, I want to thank you so much
it's a
for being
pleasure.
one of our interviewees for our Tell Me a Story project, and just encourage other people who might have an interest and have been in Sandwich for a while to be interviewed, to please call the Sandwich Public Library and ask for the archives and our archivist, which is, her name is Deb Rich, and we would love to schedule a time for you to come in and be interviewed also. Thank you so much, and for now, goodbye.